So, good afternoon and welcome to this Electric webinar on ports, the green gateways to Europe. We are broadcasting live. It is 2 o'clock in the afternoon and we are seeing the participants join online. We have more than 500 people registered for this webinar. We have a brand new piece of research to show you today, fresh from the press, you could say, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers to discuss the contents and the implications of these findings. Now, the role of ports in the transition is a somewhat overlooked theme in the sense that this study really is the first of its kind to explore this theme in such a granularity. And when you think of it, it's really a theme that deserves more attention. Think of offshore wind, all the equipment that needs to go to sea, all the electricity that needs to come back to shore. Think of the energy clusters and the energy intensive industry clusters that we have in big industrial ports in Europe today. Think of the maritime fuel switch we need to see in the coming decades. Think of the flows of goods that need to basically be transferred to onshore transport systems, and think of all the onshore, on-site operations that we have at harbors, including the provision of hopefully clean power to the docking ships. So in essence, ports are really a hub of many of the players of the energy transition, and in order to get this right, it's really critical that ports play the necessary role in the transition. So that's in essence what we have been exploring in this study, and that's also the reason why we teamed up with one of the best consultants in this space, DNVGL. They have held the pen on this very exciting report, and they have had the support of our structure of expertise in Eurelectric to see what are the links to the electricity sector and what are the potentials for electrification of some of these operations. We're going to have a real pioneer of the energy transition present this study to us. He was a CEO of Vestas Wind Systems for many years, the wind turbine producer, and today he is the CEO of DNVGL's energy practice, and it's Ditlev Engel. He's going to join us in a second. Before, we want to give you a little bit of housekeeping, because we'd like you that are out there with us to be able to participate as well, or at least chip in. We're going to have to keep the audience in listening mode, otherwise we'll have too many voices on this call. But if you have a look at the slide just below, you'll see where you can basically type in a question if you hear something that you want to comment on or send a question on during the presentation. So I hope that everything should be clear, and I think it's now time to release the suspense. With this, I want to hand over to Ditlev Engel. Ditlev, are you with us here?
I am.
Very good. We can hear your voice now. Let's see if we can get you to join on camera. Perfect.
Yep.
Welcome, Ditlev. Great to have you with us today. I really look forward to your presentation, so take it away.
Thank you very much, Christian, and thank you for the kind words, and welcome everyone, and thank you so many for joining this webinar. I have been given the task of giving you a tour de force on the presentation of the report in about 15 minutes before we go into a panel discussions. So, and of course, I will give you the highlights, but afterwards the report obviously will be available. So with that, let's go to the first slide. As Christian said as an introduction, ports are playing an absolutely vital role going forward in the energy transition. And in this study, we actually tried to look at it from various angles. And the main questions that we are trying to answer is really, what is the decarbonization potential in European ports, including industry and water transport? What is needed to transform and decarbonize ports and co-locate industries? What are the barriers and the necessary measures to unleash this potential? And what policies can accelerate the decarbonization of ports by using electrification? So these are the main themes that we will cover, and the 5 things you see on the slides we will dive into in a minute as I move into the presentation. So with that, let's move to the next slide. At DNVGL, we every year produce an energy transition outlook where we are trying to forecast the development of the industry very much based upon the expected cost development. And just a few highlights on the ETO from last year. The next update will be in September this year. But what we see here is that the share of fossil fuel will decrease from about 85% today to about half by 2050, and that solar PV and wind will provide more than 60% of electricity. We actually also, seen from a technology point of view, are pretty certain that we can deliver on the 1.5 degree target. But even we have the technology at hand, the big issue is really extraordinary efforts in implementation of this, and everybody needs to contribute in this going to happen. And it is in this spirit that we took upon, as Christian mentioned in the opening, what is the role of ports? And I have to say, from a personal perspective, that we've been doing this work. I have to say that it is becoming so abundantly clear how much we need the ports to be an active player in this in order to be able to deliver on the Paris ambitions also here in Europe. So let's move to the next one. Actually, we would be as too bold to say that ports are some of the front runners of the energy transition and can take a very, let's say, key role in this. And I think also it's important to mention here that today we know the ports, and I think a lot of people working in ports are asking themselves, when the energy transition is happening, what will that mean for the ports, and what will it mean for the jobs in the ports, as an example. And I think it's therefore also important to remember that when we look into this, it's not just about an energy transition, it's also about an industry and a job transition that needs to take place. So we move to the next one. You will see that today transport accounts for about 1/3 of the overall EU CO2 emissions. Road transport is responsible for 72% of the overall, and water transport for 14%, and air for 13%. However, when we look into, for instance, the target that are being imposed now on vehicles, etc., it means that the relative, let's say, contribution from water transport will increase significantly. And therefore, it's important again to think about how are we going to decarbonize these sectors in order to make sure that we deliver on Paris. And I think, as we all know, that they are the somewhat easier to abate sectors, and then the very hard to abate sectors. And what's exciting about this is that what we will see in the port report, that it's a very nice hybrid between both of those two challenges. So with that, let's move to the next one. So when we talk about ports being the front runners, then it's on the port authorities side that can decarbonize operations and thereby reduce energy costs. It is the fact that we can work with the maritime sector on emission and pollution reduction. And even though today I know we'll talk a lot about CO2, it's also important to remember that pollution overall is a major problem in the world, and also here in Europe. And I think also on the short term, we have, for instance, seen here from the COVID-19 situation, how much pollution can be reduced dramatically fast if we do things differently. So I think these are some of the things and the learnings we need to bring forward also when we think about this works. The utilities can provide reliable and clean energy and heat going forward into the development, and industry can really electrify the operations. All of this means that it puts the ports in, as we say, a front runner position that we need to have in the back of our mind as we look ahead. So we try to do this by looking at 10 green transitions towards this decarbonization. If you move to the next slide. And I think even you can move one more ahead. So the first 5 of the 10 green transitions towards decarbonization that we have been looking at is number 1, the electrification of port connected activities. It is the fuel switch of the maritime transport. And I know many of you are talking about what you see on the picture of the large commercial vessels, but let's also remember, and we will hear more about that in the panel debate, that there are a lot of things we can do already now on a smaller scale involving the maritime transport through electrification. So both of them are some of those issues in the maritime transport that need to be addressed. We have opportunities to electrify industry. As Christian mentioned in the opening, the use and integration of offshore wind. And in this regard, it's also important to remember that when we look at the build out of offshore wind, that we need to scale at an unprecedented pace, which also therefore means that using the current way of doing it, we simply won't be able to do it fast enough. So in our future aspiration for the offshore wind, we need to think about scaling in a very different way. And again, here the ports are an important player. The energy system and the overall integration is also a very important part where the port can contribute into this decarbonization. And if you click one more, you will see that the next 5 ones are hydrogen as a feedstock and energy vector into this. We see possibilities for phase out of fossil fuel power plants. And of course, also carbon capture and storage is another aspect to this. Plus, as I mentioned, I'll come back to that on the regulation and the fact that we can also look into a circular and bio-based economy. So these 10 green transitions are very important for the overall decarbonization. So if we move to the next one, we obviously have to say that ports are many different things. And we have therefore tried to categorize the ports of the future into 2 baskets by defining them as typical ports. So if we go to the next one, you will see we have 2 dimensions. We have one which we call an industrial port, which is a typical large industrial port, which handles mainly bulk goods and containers, co-location of power plants, and a large potential for connection of offshore wind. That is what we have defined as industrial ports. And there are about 20 of those in Europe. And then we have, I would say, the transport ports, which are typical mid-sized transport ports, mainly with passengers and containers, no significant industry, no power generation, and no potential for connection of offshore wind. But both of them are very important into the future of the development of the ports. So this is the current situation, which we call Port 1.0. And then we have looked into, let's say, the future scenario, which we call Port 2.0, with the same types of ports, and what are the opportunities at hand for both of them. So if we think about this, we could also look into the qualification of the effect of the green transition around the ports. So if we move to the next slide, you will see that there are many building blocks both for ports 1.0 and 2.0, both when it comes to the shore side, but also when it comes to the sea side, and the way that this is going to play together throughout the port operations. I think all of us have known for hundreds of years that ports have been a prerequisite for trade and the development of trade. And if we think back how important that has been, we actually have to think about ports in this light as well and say, well, looking ahead, ports needs to take its new role of being a major enabler for global goods and trade. And with that, let's then look at what can we then actually achieve for both types of ports. So if we go to the next slide, you will see here 2 or 3 different kind of scenarios. So right now, as I mentioned, these are the industrial ports, the big ones, the 20 of those that we have. And you have here the ports consumption, the hydrogen exports, the electricity export, and the CO2 emissions per ton per year, as we are today. If we then look ahead and say, what will then be the, let's say, emissions from an industrial port? And we have then said we actually think that the ports will grow significantly. So the same port in 2050 would include growth in industrial production for about 60%, cargo throughput up by 30%, but without excluding the effects of the green transition, no energy efficiency measures implemented. You will thereby see that obviously the overall emissions will go up if we continue using the ports the way we use them today. If you think about it in a different light and start to think about the industrial ports with a green transition, you will see now that we can put the ports in a position where they not only can decarbonize their own operations, but that they also can become a main renewable energy hub and exporter of renewable energy. So for instance, if you think about all the offshore wind electricity we need to bring in into shore, then we just can't let it go straight from the wind turbines into the grid. We will need to store some of it and use the ports as a facilitator for this going forward, and also thereby ensuring that the port can become an exporter of energy going forward. And as you can see on the CO2 emissions, they would go dramatically down if we start to think and use the larger port in a complete different way. But there's also a lot of things we can do for the transport port. So if we go to the next slide, you will see some of the same assumptions, namely that we will have a big increase in industrial production, cargo throughput, etc. And what will happen if we just continue as is? That is what you have in the middle of the slide. Or if we think about that the transport 2.0 with a green transition, that is the same port, including the effects of the green transition with some additional megawatts of solar PV generation, energy efficiency applied, energy efficiency based on circular economy, and electrification of industrial activities of both port operation and transport of at least 50%. And a lot of people are, of course, talking today about 2050 as the net zero, and we have not even in this anticipated that it should be net zero, but just again to show that it doesn't matter whether you are a transport, a smaller port, or whether you're in a big industrial port, there are significant things that you can contribute with, both to decarbonize your own operation, but also to be a contributor to the energy transition going forward. If we move to the next one, then this obviously also means that this will have a big impact on the green transition on the power sector. And again, here I think we can say that the power sector plays a key role in turning the ports into energy hubs. So if you take the next slide, you will see that ports, as I mentioned, are now the natural landing point for the huge planned capacity, for instance, of offshore wind. You will see that you can do electrification of industries, could mean up to 50% decrease of fossil fuel cargo, and electricity become the main carrier for the port's activities. And again, we need to be bold and think big here and say we need a regulatory environment to ensure sustainable provision for public-private partnership to accelerate the green transitions. I know that there are some ports that are public owned, but there are definitely also ports which are privately owned. And both of them are, of course, important to become a player in participating in this together with the power sector to make sure that we can use the ports as a very important enabler for what we want to achieve in the future. With that in mind, one would may say throughout the policies, well, what is it then that we need to focus on in order to make sure that this is going to happen? So if you move to the next slide, I would like to first say that the DNVGL, we are, as you also saw from the ETO report in the beginning, we are very technology optimistic. We are somewhat more regulatory pessimistic, i.e. that we can implement and make the policies fall into place in order to make sure that we can actually harvest all the benefit that technology can give us. So we have made, if you turn to the next one, we have made 11 recommendations of how we could turn the ports into front runners of the energy transition. And let me just, and also in interest of time, just focus just on 3 of them. If you look at number 1, the standardization of shore power that should be stimulated and barriers to adhere to the standards should be removed. We know that designing and standardization is absolutely critical. Just as an example of that, if you think about container vessels that were not standardized in 20, 40, and 45 feet containers, that is really what gave them a huge benefit in the maritime sector, that they managed to standardize their operations. And we all think we know how important that has been for the global development of moving goods around in the world. And we need to think similarly about how we standardize the operations going forward. There's been work being done already in the Trans-European Transport Network in order to look into the shore facilities, which of course is fine, but we need to do much more going forward and to expand this standard into other domains, to use these standards and also to the port to know how to invest. I would also like to highlight number 6, i.e. the facilitate and support, number 8, support the initial investment of hydrogen production through electrolyzers at the port. And again, here we see that there's a huge opportunity for using new technologies in a new way. And I think a lot of you are also aware of the ongoing discussions of both Energy Island, floating offshore wind and others, and all the capacity and possibilities it will have with all the electricity we can bring to shore. And finally, it is to mandate port authorities in coordination with the DSOs to facilitate the development of port energy infrastructure across multiple energy carriers. I think, and this is what we learn every day in our daily work at DNVGL, that some of the overlooked things in the discussion is how we're going to carry all the electricity and how we're going to store it. But that is, of course, as important as it is to generate it. And here again, working with the port authorities, I think provide a tremendous opportunities if we can do this in the right way. And then I think, Christian, that I have used my 15 minutes. So thank you all for listening, and I'll hand it back to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Ditlev. That was a very, very succinct and to the point presentation. I was wondering when I was listening to you, it's very clear that there's a giant potential, as you showed with your graphs. It's also very clear that let's say the starting point is somewhat different. And if we continue, if ports continue the way they're operating today, they're not going to be in line with the Paris trajectories. What, in your view, is the most important barrier holding back ports from playing their crucial role in the energy transition?
I think that we have, as I said in the opening, we have to remember that this is about a decarbonization, but it's also about a job transition. And I think it's clear that as we see now the progression of the electrification of society and the role of renewables, I think a lot of people are asking themselves, well, we are involved in, let's say, handling fossil fuels and others, and what will this mean for us going forward? Will we lose our jobs? And we know that some of these are very, very important for the job creations in Europe. And therefore, I think we also have, and one of the reasons why for making the report here is to try to show that if we think differently, then we actually can achieve a lot. And let's not forget that there's a lot of competences and knowledge today in the ports that we can use to support it. And just as an example of that, one of what's maybe not so many people know is that for instance, the wind transition that happened in Denmark was very much built upon the competences which came from the shipyard industry, which was actually going out of business because all ships were going to be made in Asia. And then you use a lot of those competences, for instance, into the wind industry. And I see a similar path here, where you could use a lot of the competences we have in the ports today to redirect it, I would sort of say, towards be an active player in the energy transition and use those competences as we are switching, let's say, from one fuel or cargo to another, and then think it in a new light. So I think that's probably where all of us have to be better how to articulate that.
So it's about seeing the opportunities. Are you saying there is somewhat of a mindset, let's say, challenge that needs to be overcome and amongst port players, or?
Well, I think we are seeing now that that's about mindset, but it's also about daring. We know that if we're going to deliver on Paris, we also need to dare. So I think we also have to say, what is it that we need to make it happen? And I think here we at industry together has a very important role combined to talk to the policymakers of what could actually make this happen. And I think already you see those ports who have invested in facilities for offshore wind are pretty happy that they did that. Handling quite large cargo volumes today and can continue to do that. But let's also remember that the electrification of the smaller ports, and I'm sure as we'll discuss a little later, has a big role to play as we electrify smaller operational vessels, as we electrify when ships comes in instead of polluting when they are in ports. So there are many things we can do both on the short and long term. And I think that's why it's so exciting to do that. And frankly speaking, at the end, if we don't really get the ports to be an active player, it will be very hard to reach the rest of the ambitions we have in the electrification of societies.
That's excellent. I have one question coming in from the audience, which is, what are the uses of energy in ports? So I'm sure you have part of the answer. I'm happy to chip in as well, but over to you first.
Well, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think I'm as much in a learning phase as many others for the moment, but I would start by pointing to the let's say to the fuels needed by the ships that come in, and then we have all the logistic on-site operations. Then we have the power for the docking ships, and of course there's also a lot, as we discussed, let's say, transformation of energy in one way or the other, from one energy carrier to the other. At least potentially, this is what needs to happen in future in order for us to be able to basically create an energy system based on decarbonized sources. Last but not least, currently at least, we really have a huge amount of solid fuels basically being deposited in ports as part of the current, let's say, energy production paradigm. So that would be my quick 2 cents on the energy uses. Is there a last word you wanna give on this before we move on in the program, Ditlev?
No, I think that I would say just maybe say that now we have launched this report today, together today, and I think what is very important to say this is now the work really starts. We have done the report, and I think it will be and that's really invite everybody for having a lot of conversation afterwards to start to think about how can we do this, because it's only, as I said, if we do a real good public-private partnership going forward that we manage to execute it and start to make things happening. And I think that's very important. And finally, frankly speaking, we need to move fast. We all know that from the CO2 challenges we have. So we are very open to engage with everybody on this topic. So looking forward to that.
That's a great note to end on, and thank you for the cooperation so far. Fully agree that this is where we start to engage further. But it's been a great ride so far with the DNVGL, and really very insightful and interesting piece of work that you have been producing here. Thank you very much to Ditlev Engel, and now it's time to get some other voices into this debate. And I'm very excited to say that we have a number of very prominent speakers with us for this panel debate. And let's see if technology is with us or against us today, and whether we can get the cameras to work as I call on the participants. We have with us today, first of all, Jannike Hilland, who's the CEO of the Norwegian utility BKK. Then we have Magnus Hall, who appeared as the first one because he's our president and also the CEO of Vattenfall. Welcome to you, Magnus. Welcome to you, Jannike. We also have with us Jørgen Bjerre, who is responsible for ports and inland navigation at DG Move in the European Commission. Let's see if we can get Jørgen up. And there we got Anastasius, so we're almost there. That's great. Anastasius Manas is also with us. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Hedno, a distribution system operator in Greece. Magnus, let me start with you. What, in your view, is the value of such a report for the power sector? I think we have a few.
Yeah. First of all, I mean, if you look to our the whole idea of the energy transition and where electrification plays a big role, and I think that's part of the study we're looking at here. To me, it's very much a learning exercise to understand how society is put together when you look at the different options for the future, and now describing what the ports and their roles, and if you actually think about it, how much it connects to the energy world and the electricity world, you start wondering, why haven't we thought about that before? Do we need a study like this to understand it? And to me, so you can see, and Ditlev was talking about 4 different parts there, where you have electrification of course of the ports themselves, which is very important and interesting business opportunity for our industry. I think the new maritime fuels that you will look at, how can they be produced? Will they be hydrogen based on electrification or something else? I think there are business opportunities. And then if you go all the way through this, I would say that learning, it's a learning exercise, and where we will start the discussions with the ports now to much better understand and how can we do business and how can we support in the transition. So I think this is a very important piece of a study for our industry, and sort of a starting point of how we can take this discussion further on. So a great piece of work, really interesting if you go into the details, and reveals new things that I think you haven't thought of before. So there are great opportunities for our industry to participate in this as well.
Reading this study, Magnus, what was the first, let's say, or primary policy message or message that came to your mind for policymakers?
Well, it's really about the standardization of port, which makes it, I mean, it's very clear that if you're going to have ships who go into different ports, and ships by definition, I guess, visit many different ports, you have to standardize this shore power that you have. And I think that's extremely important, because a lot of those ships stand there, and if they can't get connected, they will just burn oil to make sure that they have their energy running. And I can see that as sort of a very simple first point let's do that, and be very clear about doing it very quickly. That was my first takeaway, and I don't know how far we are in that, but I can see the importance of it.
No, I fully agree. It makes a lot of sense, even if it may not be quite as sexy as higher targets or more ambition. But indeed, as Ditlev also mentioned, the 20-foot container, the 40-foot container are the real heroes of globalization, because they were the ones that allowed us to basically start moving stuff around in much greater volumes than we did before. Janneke, perhaps over to you. Your company BKK is a utility that basically traditionally has had a role in hydropower and continues to do so. So production of electricity with the help of hydro plants. But you have created a company called Plug that basically has as its core mission to provide shore power to the port of Bergen. How does that compute? How does traditional power supplier and port operations compute in your mind? And how did you get to that idea of going into that business area?
Thank you, Christian. Bergen is the busiest cruise destination in Europe. We have about 300 cruise arrivals every year. So our question was, how can we make the maritime sector more sustainable? We want to be part of the solution. So we built shore power for better air quality and less emissions. And as you know, the energy mix in our part of Europe is about 75% renewable. So the electrification is really, really efficient when it comes to emissions. As you say, this requires competence. We know the energy system. That's our advantage. We build infrastructure, both onshore and offshore. So together with the port, we have developed innovative solutions to build Europe's largest shore power facility for ships.
That's very interesting. I'm wondering, further to the discussion we just had on the standards. So if you have a whole range of cruise ships coming into this port of Bergen, do they all have a different plug in quotation marks, or is there a standardization issue that you've been having to look into as part of this?
The standardization issue is really important. So thank you for that question. It's there are already international standards for some of our within some parts of the sector, for instance, cruise. We need more standardized solutions because it's impossible to be a customer if it's not standardized solutions. But we are definitely on the way, and we are working on this issue.
I'm also curious to hear about, because I know that Bergen is one of those places where, or at least the Norwegian fjords are one of those places where we begin to see electrified ships, all electrified ships. Is that something that you're considering as part of your next business ventures, or how does that look?
We are working to solve the electrification issues on all types of transport, really. So also on other types of ferries, for instance, ships going to the fjords. We work on all that, and it's great to see how the market changes and how rapidly the market changes. Now about 50% of the ships arriving Bergen can use shore power. So it's an amazing development in the market. And our challenge is to make a competitive product, because it's not a requirement yet to use shore power. But so we have to give the customers a good experience. I think we do that because we have developed an easy, quick way to charge or to be on shore power. And we see a massive interest from all sorts of ports coming to us and see how we do this. And I think there's a change in society we see now. We see that the authorities, the passengers, and the owners of maritime sector want to be more sustainable, and that really motivates us. So we want to meet their demands. And I would like to welcome you all to come to Bergen and see the plant.
You can count on me coming. We just need to fix that COVID thing.
Thank you.
So maybe one last question before I turn to Anastasius. is there one key learning that you want to share when it comes to, let's say, the cooperation with ports? What is it that you've seen? I mean, it's really a different type of client, if you will, or a different type of player that we normally perhaps haven't been so aware of. So is there something that you've taken away here that is worthwhile sharing?
I think there must be a mutual respect, putting the customer in the center, and that's for us, that's learning, because we know the energy system, and the ports know the maritime sector, so we really have to work together. But from my experience, I think the most important learning is, and Ditlev Engel touched upon it, is the authorities. They need to be ambitious, and they need to set the targets, because we are really running out of time. But we see that the whole sector is changing so rapidly. If the authorities are clear on their targets and on their ambitions.
So the critical role for authorities, very good point to take with us. Anastasios, over to you. So you are the CEO of a Greek distribution system operator, and maybe you can you saw that one of the key recommendations of the study is actually that distribution system operators and ports should work together to build the necessary infrastructures at ports. Do you hear me? Well,
yes, I can hear you.
Very good. So I was wondering, what's your perspective? Is this something you can recognize from your experience?
Thank you, Christian. Yes, there is an important role in collaboration between ports and DSOs. So, and DSOs can have a vital role in this upgrade. So, to extend the energy supply to ports, cold ironing, provide licensing for RA's installation, develop and provide know-how such as rules, procedures, experts to transformations of the ports into smart ports, version 1 or version 2, especially in terms of energy management system, and to provide, of course, support in the area of the regulatory framework of using green electric energy as an alternative fuel, and in bilateral transactions in ship to port or port to grid. So we envision that we can help and minimize the bureaucratic procedures for these kind of transformations, and we can support in the discussions with the regulatory bodies in introducing incentives, measures, tariff policies of electricity in ports. So the idea is how we can, as a key success factor, how ports can establish a proactive and strategic collaboration with the DSOs timely, in order to be in front of what is coming rather than following afterwards.
So I imagine that the geography in Greece provides a special situation with all the many islands. Is that an issue, and in what way is that an issue in relation to the port's infrastructure and the issues that you have at hand with regard to decarbonization of such operations?
Okay, so let me take a couple of minutes to share a few information about Greece. Piraeus, as you know, first of all, is #8 port in Europe, but nevertheless, Greece has around 2,500 islands, 6,000 very small ones, 253 inhabited, and each of those islands have 1 to 2 very small ports in terms of European standards, and 29 are not interconnected with the mainland grid. So in most of these islands today, electricity is based on fossil fuels, while supported to some extent by limited renewables, since it's a local system. So in Greece, we already have in place around 50 short sea shipping lines. Needless to say that decarbonization has been a major challenge for the country, not only for the ports, but also for the electric plants in this island. So it's really more holistic, the issue there. And due to the EID and MCPD directives. So our role as HEDNO is to act as an enabler for the energy transition of the Greek power market, in line also with the NCEP, the National Energy Climate Plan for 2030, and create value for the country. So taking this into account, the country's policy consists of, first of all, accelerating the interconnection plan with the mainland grid via submersible cables, promoting and encouraging the development and deployment of renewables in appropriate territories. On the one hand, ports can accommodate to some extent renewables like photovoltaics. On the other hand, in Greece, we do not need to install wind parks in offshore plants, but in reality, in small islands. Instead, there we have to figure out and ensure that there are no environmental issues. Now, the ports in the big islands is also a different story. It can be the electric hubs, for example, where submersible cables come from either the mainland grid or nearby wind parks or other renewables. And moreover, the framework lately, the framework of storage units has been updated so that the optimized energy management is allowed and facilitated. So ports can really take advantage of this new evolution to their benefit. In another area, the refurbishment of the new building of short sea shipping vessels, mainly car passenger ferries, which can allow for use, which can be either electric or hybrid electric, based on batteries, could be under consideration, like the Norway and Finland are already doing. Lastly, there is already a plan under study to elaborate interim or emergency solutions, according to which green, or greener at least, electric energy can be provided to the islands from ships via the ports, acting as energy hubs, reverse cold ironing, for example. And given the number of islands and the opportunities, can really have a value in that case. So it is anticipated that via this course of actions, ports will be able to help in the decarbonization of the country, both of the power plants and ships in the islands via win-win schemes.
Thank you, Anastasios. No, very fascinating points. Certainly, one thing I take away from this is that it's a very diverse challenge also in Greece, with really different types of ports and a very big distributed network of smaller ports that again, at least in my thinking, would point back to the critical role of standardization. I think we'll maybe come back to some of these points in a second. Jorgen, first over to you. You work with ports and inland navigation at the European Commission, and last year the European Commission came forward with the new Green Deal, which is a massive investment project in a cleaner and greener Europe. 1 trillion euros at stake over the next decade, and that number has really been reinforced with the recovery packages that have been decided upon as a consequence of COVID. How does the whole role of ports and what you've seen in this webinar and perhaps also in the report play together with what you're planning in the context of the Green Deal in the transport space?
Yeah, thank you, Christian, and first of all, thank you to Euroelectric and to DNVGL for the invitation to this webinar and for the study on ports presented here today. I think it's a very interesting report, excuse me, which provides really excellent input and food for thought as well to your members and stakeholders and to ports, to the authorities, as was mentioned, and also to policymakers. And now on the European Green Deal, when it was presented last year, the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated that the Green Deal would be our strategy for growth. And as underlined then when the Commission at the end of May this year presented its very ambitious proposal for a recovery package, as you mentioned, this has become even more important in the context of the need for an economic push to recover from the COVID-19 crisis. I think from, well, the Green Deal contains many important initiatives from the perspective of DG Move and from the maritime and port sector perspective, I would in particular highlight two of them. First of all, the Green Deal. In the Green Deal, the Commission has announced that it would put forward a new strategy on sustainable and smart mobility by the end of 2020. And this strategy will set out how to meet the target in the Green Deal to reduce the transport-related greenhouse gas emissions, as mentioned in your report, by 90% by 2050. And it will also announce the key areas and initiatives in transport and mobility for which the Commission will consider policy actions and in the coming years and beyond that. And the second initiative I will mention, and the second initiative I will mention here is the so-called Fuel EU Maritime initiative, which should be presented by the end of 2020, and it will aim to create a sufficient demand in the market for the use of sustainable fuels in maritime transport. And we will also consider setting separate emission targets, limits for ships in navigation and ships at berth. And this could create this strong boost for the use of onshore power supply or equivalent systems by ships. And I think it would be of great importance for ports and for the considerations of future investments.
Thank you very much, Jorgen. We look forward to seeing that strategy and to contributing to it. Is this theme of standardization that we've touched upon a couple of times also something that you're considering in this relation, in this regard?
Yes, it is, and it's as you mentioned in the report, there is already a high voltage standard which is set, and in addition to the initiatives I mentioned here, the Commission will also be revising the 10T regulation and the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Directive, which is sort of guides the supply side then of the alternative fuels strategy. And I think that would probably be the appropriate moment, and also to look at whether further harmonization could be considered in this context. I would just say that for the public consultation on the strategy, it was launched yesterday, and the one on the Fuel EU Maritime initiative will be launched either today or tomorrow. So I will of course encourage you and all stakeholders to participate in this public consultation on the Commission's Have Your Say website.
Just out of curiosity, I've been reflecting on this question about the maritime fuels, just as with the aviation industry. In a sense, I mean, we can decarbonize Europe, but in order to decarbonize those sectors, we'd need to have a global effort. How do you see? How do you look at that question and look to ensuring that ultimately the ships will also be able to fuel clean fuels when they depart from other ports in other parts of the world? Is that something you're devoting attention to?
Yes, that's a very important aspect, because of course the international maritime transport sector is extremely competitive, so that
I think Jorgen froze just at a very, very good cliffhanger, something very important he was about to say, and then we lost the signal. Jorgen, do you mind? We lost you just for around 30 seconds when you gave that crucial reply. Could you repeat it?
Yes, I'll see if I can remember what I wanted to say then. Yes, it's of course international maritime transport is extremely competitive, and of course it needs to be seen. Any measures need to be seen in this context, and we will have to in particular do this in the context of the IMO, of the International Maritime Organization, and ensure that whatever we take of measures in Europe are also compatible with the international measures. And also to, as you also point out in the report, I think it's very important to look at the issue of the risk of carbon leakage when ships are bunkering.
Very good. Our president will need to leave a little bit early today, because we all have all these webinars going on all the time. I know you're moving on to others. Is there anything you want to contribute to the discussion before you have to leave, Magnus?
I would happily just mention one thing, because one out of the 4 things that Ditlev mentioned when it comes to the front runners of the energy systems and the ports, it's about the electrification of industry, and connecting that to hydrogen. To me, is if we want policy makers to really drive the change towards an electrified and decarbonized society, I think industrial processes are a significant part of that. And where do you place a big industrial process? It's in a harbor, right? And where you can, and then you will have to have the grids there, and you will have to have everything. We are currently involved in such a discussion in Sweden here to make steel without any emissions of CO2. And one of the discussions is, of course, how can we then meet the next stage of development in terms of demonstration plants? And that would be my mentioning, that we need to think beyond just small experiments. We need to look at the bigger next picture on where you're going to jointly with industry invest in something which you believe has a potential for the future, and where ports and the combination, localization, and I think that policy part I would like to mention specifically is something that we will push also to the politicians and policymakers, because if we want this change really to take place, and we need to share a little bit of risk at the beginning in order to make that happen. And I can clearly see that indication in the study here, which is supporting our argumentation for that. So I would like to leave you with that, because I think that industry electrification is going to be a very important part of our transition of the energy system.
Thank you very much, Magnus, and thank you for being with us today. So good luck with your next meetings, and I think we can deactivate the camera of Magnus now.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, Janneke, I think you had raised the hand. Did you want to come in with a comment?
Yes, there's the sound. Yeah. Yes, thank you, Christian. Just a comment on the decarbonization of the maritime sector, because I think what we're discussing today is so important about the green ports, because now we're discussing electrification and shore power. But the way we see it is that for longer distances, higher speeds, we will have hybrid solutions, electric solutions together with hydrogen. And the future green ports will have to support both these fuels in a way. We are in a consortium now, a big consortium, to develop a value chain for liquid hydrogen for the maritime sector. Liquid is there, for instance. And I think this is part of the future energy mix for a decarbonized maritime sector. And green ports, really important in that.
Very good point. I think something that I hear a lot in this debate is also the crucial role potentially of ammonia and also methanol as potential, let's say, energy vectors that could be considered in this space. Ditlev, you wanted to come in?
I think a bit also what Janneke mentioned, that we have to remember putting the customer in the center. And for the maritime sector, the vessels they are going to buy today are the ones that are going to live in this in 20 years from now. And so keep moving the goalpost around is probably the most toxic thing we can do. So it's very, very important for this standardization and for this inspiration level to talking to the maritime sector and absolutely make it clear what do they need, so they know how to invest. And I think this is, so we work a lot also at DNVGL with the maritime sector, and therefore the more we can help them in this sense, the easier it's for them also to allocate the capital, because otherwise, it's people will just stand and wait, and that's the only thing we cannot afford. So as long as I think people can live with most regulation, as long as they don't keep changing. And I think that's maybe on top of the 11 policy recommendations, just to remember.
Makes good sense. Makes good sense, Ditlev. We have a question coming in from the audience, which is, were ports involved in the making of the report? And I think I can answer that, and the answer is yes. And we also had several ports involved. So, but this is something, as has been said a couple of times during this conversation today. It's really something that is already ongoing, but we're also, let's say, at the beginning of this, and much more is to come, and much more will happen. We're coming towards the end, so unless somebody raises his hand and says they want to add last comment here, I think I would start slowly wrapping up. I think it's been a very, very fascinating discussion. This is clearly uncharted land, even if a lot is going on in the space. We hear about companies that are already operating. We hear about ports that are already changing. We also hear a lot about many things that need to happen. I won't dare to try to summarize what I've heard because there's been so much, but a few reflections. The first one would certainly be that there's a huge opportunity for ports here. Entirely new industrial value chains that need to be built or grandly expanded. Electrification that can help clean up, modernize, and save energy. So a huge opportunity for ports. A second key, let's say, conclusion from my side would be there's also risk that if ports don't get going, or the ports that don't get going really risk becoming a bottleneck, because things need to move fast. We are in a hurry, and things need to scale up very quickly. So if we don't see change, then there's going to be a problem. And the third one would be that there's a great interest, as I hear it, from both the distribution system operators, from the power producers, to engage, to cooperate, to advance and accelerate these transformations. So that's another good piece of news. And perhaps the fourth and last is the critical role of regulation here. That we need the authorities to the help of authorities to make this happen. And that there's a number of things that need to play together. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult or even impossible. So Jorgen, we bank on you and your colleagues to produce some very useful frameworks for us to get going. This was all for today. The report can be downloaded on our webpage. I want to thank all the participants of this discussion. It has been really great to have you, and a special thanks, of course, to DNVGL for this great cooperation. In a second, if there's some journalists on the call, we are going to host a press point, and if you don't have the information for that yet, you can contact Joanna Petku or Mona from DNVGL, and they will provide you with the necessary login details. So this starts at 1500 sharp. I also, before we close up, would like to leave you with a glimpse of upcoming webinars from Eurelectric. On the 16th of July, we are looking into how to power the European e-mobility transformation, something that's going to go very fast, and by the way, also is going to have a link, of course, to the ports, at least in the heavier segments. So don't miss out on that critical webinar. In September, we have a number of things coming up in digital, and we will soon provide dates for our power barometer, which shows the latest trends in the power sector. And we also have a major piece coming up on electricity storage. So thank you to everybody for joining. Have a great day and see you around.